World Englishes is a branch of applied linguistics, and it is one of the emerging fields in recent decades. In today's lecture, we will discuss European colonization, a few introductory observations. So this lecture is relevant in two fields, in two areas of studies: post-colonial studies as well as in world Englishes. I teach this topic in world Englishes, but it is also relevant, as I told, if you're studying post-colonial studies. Let's begin and see. The beginning. At the dawn of the modern age, later in the 15th century, European powers set out to conquer the world, right? So we're talking about late 15th century, right? That was because it began from northern Europe, like Spain and Italy, Portugal, France, and later on we also see England on the map. So, from the early explorer of that time to the Berlin Conference of 1884, from the late 15th century till 1884, when the Berlin Conference held, they entered the race for colonies. And these different European countries occupied different parts of the world and made colonies there for various motives, but essentially to increase their economic and political strength and power. Several motives and reasons were there, right? But primarily to increase their economic and political strength because they were competitive with each other. England was there, France was there, Spain was there, Portugal was there, Italy was there. So they were in competition. For what? For political strength and for economic strength and prosperity also. So several reasons combined to drive this development. Other reasons were also there. We will discuss one by one. So reason are motives behind colonization, right? So we are discussing the most fundamental and basic question in post-colonial studies as well as in world Englishes, that what were the motives and reason behind colonization. Why the British they came to Indian subcontinent? Why the British arrived to North America? Why the Spain, the France arrived to North and South America, different parts of the world, right? So we will see now. The first one, that is social reason. Now, what is social reason for colonization? With the decline of feudal system in Europe, right? So we see that in medieval period we saw feudal system where the land belonged to the kings, the nobles, and lesser nobles, the knights, and the peasant had very terrible and poor life in feudal system. So as the medieval period ended, so feudal system also declined in Europe. And the surplus of population in some countries, the nobility and the landowners were forced to seek their fortune in adventures abroad. You got it. End of feudal system in Europe. So then what happened? There was surplus of population in some countries. What would they do if there was no work for them? So the nobility and the landowners were forced to seek their fortune in adventure abroad. These nobles, landowners, they were forced go and seek your fortunes, right? And then they start, you see that discovery. what we call voyages of discovery. Through sea routes, they went, they discovered, they occupied, they looted, they forced people, and they took wealth and riches from there. So the first one was social reason. What was social reason? Feudal system decline. And in a result, population surplus. And these land owners, landlords, land owners, and nobilities were forced to go and seek your fortunes abroad in adventures abroad. Second reason was technological reasons. New shipbuildings and navigations, because there was shipbuildings, improvement in technology, sea routes were discovered, there was navigation techniques improved or invented and then improved, which made the longer overseas journey and exploration possible. We can see Vasco da Gama, we can see Columbus, right? We can see other explorer, because of what? Because of this navigation techniques and because of the new shipbuildings. What happened? This is so called technological reasons. They went and they made colonies in different parts of the world. Economic reason. Economic ones like the growth of capitalisms and desire for profit. Every country, everybody wants to have money, to have income, to have profit. So desire for profit and to have more capital, they went and they made colonies different parts of the world. Economic reason. So far we discussed social reason and we talk about technological reason and now we're talking about economic reason. And political reasons. Political ones like the increasing competition between European powers. So many European powers were there. As I talked about, England was there, France was there, Portugal was there, and Spain was there. So there was competition between them. So for political reasons to have to show their dominancy or political strength, they occupied. For example, that if one country occupied one territory, one area, another country went and occupied another territory or other country or other area. So that was political strength. Cultural reasons. Now, cultural ones like a zeal for machinery's activity, accompanied by an unquestioned belief in the white man's and the Christian's faith superiority. Excuse me. So, this is the culture. There was zeal for machinery. Okay, these religious people activities accompany, so these machineries activities accompanied by the unquestioned belief, they did not accept on this belief in the white man's and the Christian's faith superiority, that white man is here to rule other and there should be the superiority of Christianity, right? So this was cultural reason which did not leave room for moral concerns even with respect to the conquest and enslavement of foreign peoples. They enslaved foreign people, they conquered foreign people. There was no room and respect for other religions, for other cultures, for other people. So, this is a type of brutality, what they did. Now, the shift from early motives. So, these were early motives. So, there is now shift from early motives. The early motive of improving trading conditions, especially with Asia, right? So, the early motives were, so sorry, these are not the early, these are the early motives. They first they wanted to have trade, to have economy, to have profit. So the early motives are improving trade conditions, especially with Asia, soon gave way to other causes of colonization. First, they wanted to have trade with Asia, spices, gold, mines. And then they gave way to other causes of colonization. For example, the exploitation of indigenous resources. They exploited the resources of indigenous and local people to the advantage of one's own nations. So, for the sake of their own nation, they exploited indigenous resources. And now we can see still the aftermath of this looted conditions, this exploitation, or what they did with us, with Asians. So the satisfaction of land need for settlement. They also needed land for settlement. They sent their people and they lived there. So the imperialist expansion of one's political and economic power, and finally, quite simply, the internal competition between the European power with balanced changings in the course of time. So first we can see the imperial expansions of one political. First they wanted to expand their political power and economic power. And finally, that was imperialism. And finally, quite simply, the internal competition between the European powers, different European powers, as I talk about. Spain was there, England was there, Portugal was there, with the balance changings in the course of time. Now, Britain entered this race as at a relatively late point in time, but turned out to be highly successful in the long run. So she entered later on, perhaps in 16th century, but the most successful one. It is said that in the time of Queen Victoria, the sun never set in the empire of Great Britain. They ruled everywhere. Now, Portuguese as the first expansionist. Portuguese were the first expansionists where they expanded their empire. The first agents in the expansionist strategies were Portuguese explorers who in the 15th century ventured down to the West Africa coast, establishing fortified outposts. Who? Portuguese. And ultimately found a naval route to India. And then they had trade with India, thus opening radically new perspective to the lucrative oriental trades, right? So they opened way for trades from Africa to India, and they established their outposts there, where in different parts of Africa. Spanish as the another expansionist. After Portuguese, we can see Spanish. Spanish support of Columbus. Voyages was motivated by the jealousy of Portuguese. They had jealousy with Portuguese. They support Columbus, who was not actually Spanish, right? He was Italian actually, okay, and he was supported by Spain, okay, and his discovery of America in 1492 opened Central and South America, with the exception of Brazil, which became Portuguese, right? Brazil, which became Portuguese, to settlement and exploitations with horrible consequences for the indigenous people and culture. Who did it? Spanish, right? So Spanish went, okay, with the help of they supported financially Columbus. He opened the gate, Central and South America, right, with the exception of Brazil, which became Portuguese, okay, and they did settlement and exploitations there. with horrible consequences for the indigenous peoples and culture. What drove the Spanish to colonization? The Spanish were driven by the curious mixture of greed for gold. They went there, greed for gold, land, and power combined with machinery, zeal legitimized by the Pope. Pope legitimized, they'd go there and make people Christian, Christianize these areas, right? So the greed for the gold, land, and power combined with machinery zeal. Okay, so gold and land and power combined with machinery legitimized by the Pope. Fine. Excuse me. So we learn here that there was a greed for gold, for land, and power, as well as machinery zeals legitimized by the Pope. So the colonial powers which came later in the 17th century were more interested in trade, wealth, and also possession of land for settlement. We're talking about Britain will come here, France will come here now. The Dutch. The Dutch established a colony in South and expanded into uh, Asia, where, for example, they founded Malacca in today's Malaysia and held Indonesia for centuries. Who? The Dutch. Another, we can see, colonizer. They made colonies in Malaysia and Indonesia. The Dutch. Now, the French. The French competed with the British in North and Central America and later in Africa. So they French arrived to Africa also and they competed with British in North and Central America also. Colonies were frequently objects of negotiations between European power. So they negotiated. You can make colony here and I'll make colony there. You cannot come here and I won't go there. So there was mutual agreement between these European power then. And not frequently change hands as a consequences as some war fought for treaties signed in far away Europe. So what happened that European power and not infrequently change hands as a consequence of some war. Sometimes, okay, we can see, but not very rarely we can see this. Infrequently change hands. Equally, they change different parts of the world, right? Because of the war. But later on, we can see treaty among between these European power, and then there was fix, okay, that you can come here, we can go there. So take South Africa is a case in point which became British after the Napoleonic wars, after Napoleonic War, right? You can see the South America, sorry, the South Africa as a case in point which became British after the Napoleonic Wars and in the Congress of Vienna of 1815, even in the absence of notable settlement there up to that point, right? So sometimes we can see that there is change also, but there is very much infrequent. Scramble for Africa. The last of these fierce series of competition was what came to be known as the Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. So they occupied Africa in late 19th century. Berlin Conference of 1854-1855 by the most of the by then most of the world had been divided up between the European colonial power into possessions. Now, colonies and sphere of influence. The exception was Africa. Only Africa was left, just explored and made familiar by the expedition of Livingstone's Stanley another. So, on this continent, which promised new resources, markets, and wealth, whenever they saw the market, the wealth, and the gold, they jumped like a dog, okay, like a hungry animal, and they looted and seem to be still available as the European power struggles to build and expand their footholds. So many of these strategic conflicts were settled in the Berlin Conference. Did not fight with each other. There should be mutual agreement of 1884-85 in which rules of conduct in the setting up new colonies in Africa were agreed upon. Now, if you want to set a colony in Africa, you have to follow these rules in Berlin. This is something very interesting. Consequences of Berlin Conference. The decisions made there resulted in nominal and frequently artificial borders. These borders were nominal and artificial between these European powers, drawn without considering the ethnic composition or regional homogeneity of newly formed colony. So this was also cruelty and injustice with them. Okay, that like excuse me, like artificial borders were drawn between without looking the ethnicity, the people, right, and they divided them. So most of today's nation state of Africa, together with their ethnic and linguistic homogeneity, and all the problems resulting from this because of these boundaries, they destroyed them, right? They were homogeneous people, but they divided them. So can be traced back to that period. Indirectly, however, these origin conditions are also responsible for the strong second language role of English in many of these states. Many of these states it is used as second language in African states. Now, the compositions of the state of Nigeria, for instance, founded as the protectorates and then turned into colony early in the 19th century can be traced back to the recognition of British sphere of influence at Berlin's and subsequently the foundations of the Royal Niger's Company in 1886. The strong role of English in today's Nigeria is clearly caused by its ethnic neutrality in the highly multi ethnic polity. This is okay what they did with these people. Results of colonization history tends to be written from the perspective of those in power. So they wrote history for us. But we must be careful to avoid sharing trends and perspective. Colonialisms meant huge amount of violence, sufferings, and cruelty to indigenous population. Most notoriously, it brought about the infamous institutions of slavery and the enslavement of millions of Africans. And these Africans were brought to America for gold mines. More generally, it entailed the loss of liberty and the development of uh, perspectives for indigenous cultures. In some cases, even their eradication, it is hard to see how people who perceive themselves as faithful Christians could act so reluctantly, right? How, sorry, Christians could act as relentlessly. Religious conversions. The last slide, sorry. Religious conversions. The more uh, justification for colonial conquest driven from the desire to convert pagan peoples and thus to save their souls. This was all justification that they were pagans, right? They did not follow any religions. They were not Christians. So we came here to save their souls and sanctions and supported by the Roman Catholic Church and more uh, generally by the colonizers. So firm belief in their cultural superiority over uncivilized and indigenous peoples and their obligation to develop them. So it means okay that they were uncivilized, they were pagans, and they were like weak, okay, and it was the obligation of European people to go here and to civilize them, to give them religion and to make them strong. This is amazing. This is disgusting. It was epitomatized in Rudyard Kipling's well known poem about the white man's burdens. Machinery's activities, in particular, which in many cases have probably been more influential on the ground for the average human individual than political decisions, have to be viewed as double-edged sword. On the one hand, they have improved many people's life, bringing healthcare learnings and healthcare learning and a message of love and humanism. But on the other hand, they have failed to pay respect to indigenous cultures and have contributed to their weakening and eradications in too many cases. That was religious conversion. Thank you so much. It was a historical background and perspective to colonization, European colonization. We begin the motives and where these people settled in different parts of the world. The lecture is relevant, as I told, to world Englishes also, because after that I discussed to my students, okay, that how English arrived to these parts of the world and what are the different varieties of English spoken here where the British settled, right? Thank you so much. Please do provide your valuable comments about today's lecture.